action, something that we haven't seen from the Conservative Party in over a decade.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm resuming a question that I asked initially in question period on May 29th. I asked it to the honourable former member of Emergency Preparedness. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned in my question at the time that I thought he was working very hard and doing quite an exceptional job. My plea tonight will be to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary and through her to our new Minister of Emergency Preparedness to please take steps to establish a national climate emergency task force. What the former Minister of Emergency Preparedness was doing and what my question May 29th pertained to was the current at that time and which continued through the summer to this day, extraordinary wildfire situation across Canada. We were seeing wildfires across the country and we continue to. And the efforts really led a lot of us across different party lines to call for a national forest fire fighting force, a national water bomber fleet, in other words, national, not just federal. But in terms of preparedness for what we're going to see and what we see more all the time, we need federal government leadership, but provinces, territories, local governments, and especially First Nations governments at the table, sharing lessons learned and moving forward together. There's never been an issue that demands of us a nonpartisan shared response of all hands on deck, like the climate emergency. On June 18th of 2019, I mentioned this in my question back in May, we in this chamber passed a motion that we were in a climate emergency, yet the government has never acted as though we were in an emergency. We are literally in it every single day between fires, floods, permafrost melt, extreme weather events of all kinds, from tornadoes to extreme windstorms, derechos, and we really don't have the response and the resilience to respond to these events when they occur to save lives. Now, obviously, as Greens, we want the government to do those things that are required to avoid levels of climate crisis to which we cannot adapt. That's another debate. We really need to take steps to reduce our emissions dramatically, but we also need to prepare for those levels of climate events which we can no longer avoid from what is baked in. Let me give you an example, Mr. Speaker. In the question of heat domes, we know that the federal government response in the National Adaptation Plan says that we will continue to have Canadians die in heat domes till the year 2040. Now, why is that? That's because they've decided at a bureaucratic approach, the only way to save lives in a heat dome is to make sure every Canadian lives in has access to an air-conditioned space. It's good as far as it goes. But 619 British Columbians died in 4 days in 2021. All those lives could have been saved with emergency measures that are easy and affordable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the King's Privy Council for Canada and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her important question. But before I begin, I'd like to express my sorrow and my sincere condolences to the family and friends of the 4 firefighters who lost their lives in a crash last week in northern BC. This brings to 8 the number of firefighters we've lost in Canada in the direct line of duty this wildfire season. They died protecting their fellow Canadians. We as a nation need to recognize this sacrifice. I'd like to provide an update on what has been going on the ground. These past weeks, the wildfire risk, while still present, has greatly diminished across the country. But this summer, over 6,000 wildland fires have burned more than 17 million hectares of land in Canada, the equivalent of roughly twice the land mass of the province of New Brunswick. More than 200,000 Canadians were forced to flee from their homes, and too many of them now have no home to return to. Particularly this year, we have seen the dire effects of climate change destroy communities and livelihoods. I join the member opposite in her call for action on climate change, and I know she stands with our government in support of the urgent need to address this challenge. This summer, once again, our government responded present when provinces were confronted with challenging situations they could not face alone. During this year's wildfire season, the Government of Canada received and approved 11 requests for assistance, or RFAs, related to wildfire situations in Nova Scotia, Quebec, Alberta, Ontario, British Columbia, and the Northwest Territories. Through these RFAs, we deployed Canadian Armed Forces through Oplentis to provide support in a wide range of roles, including personnel for planning, coordination, basic firefighting, airlift resources, and engineering support. Multiple federal departments were also engaged in assisting Canadians. Employment and Social Development Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada, the RCMP, the Canadian Coast Guard, Health Canada, Parks Canada, Indigenous Services, and Innovation, Science and Economic Development made sure all hands were on deck to help Canadians through this difficult time. Mr. Speaker, I've just provided an overview of our immediate response to the emergency situations underway across the country this summer. Mais, Monsieur le Président, quand la fumée se
But when the smoke clears, we can see the damage left behind. We know that the road back to normalcy will be a long one. That's why the disaster financial assistance arrangements are so important.
Quand les coûts engendrés
When the costs of a disaster are too great for a province, the federal government can cover up to 90% of the costs, including non-insurable damage to primary residences.
When disaster strikes, Canadians can rest assured that the federal government will be there to help them through the response and recovery. But, Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite said, we have to work lockstep with our provinces and territories and Indigenous communities to address our new reality. And I look forward to working with the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands on making sure that Canada is ready and able to respond. Thank you. Merci.
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to my honorable friend, the Parliamentary Secretary, and congratulations to her on this new role. Look, this is the last place in the world we need partisanship. Everybody in this place will know that I've been talking about the threat of the climate crisis for about 40 years. I've watched and I've had a front row seat to failure after failure. We need to avoid the worst of the climate crisis. The government steps so far don't get us there, but we also need to be prepared to save lives now. I want to stress that we need to have a real functioning, working group of multi-party, multi-jurisdictional efforts in a national climate change task force that shares lessons learned. Lessons learned, like from areas near Williams Lake in the heat dome, where if people had gotten into a cold bath with ice, their life would have been saved instead of waiting and waiting for an ambulance to take them to arrive dead on arrival at the hospital. We know we need to do more, and we need to learn from each other.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I echo what the member opposite has said. The reality is, with climate change and the impacts, we have seen unprecedented wildfires this last season, and they will continue. And that's why our government designed Canada's first ever national adaptation strategy, a whole-of-government action plan to increase the resilience of Canadian communities and respond to the impacts of climate change. Thanks to this strategy, we are making major investments in forest fire prevention, flood mapping, and disaster-resistant infrastructure projects. En travaillant avec nos partenaires.
By working with our provincial, territorial, and Indigenous partners on regional vulnerabilities and engaging in active risk mitigation, we will permanently increase our country's resilience and build our disaster response capacity to better protect Canadians in this new climate reality.
I thank the member opposite, and I look forward to working with her lockstep on making sure Canadians are safe. Thank you.
Comme il est 19h.
As it is